that the sun shines down its power to all the world and makes the wind blow strong as it will. I wonder hope gentle rains can fall upon the land, so lovely earth can stay lovely still. Good afternoon, good morning, good whatever time it is, ladies and gentlemen. This is Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom FInnell. This is Tom FInnell. Wave to the people, Tom. And I am George Harvey. Thank you. And hold your applause. I've been asked by two people this week for autographs. I know. I've got at least two watchers. Anyway. Every day I go to the internet and I search the news for my things to put up for my blog, which is geoharvey.wordpress.com. And I searched several hundred headlines, 205 this morning, as a matter of fact. No, that isn't right. It was actually about, that was just renewable energy. The nuclear search was separate, so I think it was more like 350.
I know you're busy.
Yeah, I'm busy. In the early morning, I started today at 4:30 and was feeling like I was extremely late getting off. But anyway, I post the day's news for energy and climate change at my blog, geoharvey.wordpress.com, and some of it makes its way into Green Energy Times, which I also write for, and I'm starting a new blog, by the way, which is a blog of commentary, which I started yesterday, just posting a thing which came from news that I'm going to be talking about today, and it's called Geo Harvey's Comments. I think that's what it is.
All energy related? Or?
All energy related. It's just one comment a week I'm going to put up there.
Oh, okay.
Just a comment, but we'll touch on that
because the best of the best.
Yeah, well. It's kind of an aggregation of things that have happened in the news and that point in a particular direction. And today we're going to hit that big time because it's a big piece of news that comes on Sunday. But we will start with what happened on Friday, the 5th of September. The German state Mecklenburg-Vorpommern.
Say that again.
Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And I don't pronounce Vorpommern correctly. It's hard for me to wrap my tongue around those R's. Produced enough power from renewable resources last year to satisfy its entire energy demand.
That is, now they weren't satisfying all their demand. They were able to.
They were able to. They were satisfying.
But they were moving power.
They were moving power around, but I think the point is they produced more power. They produced more power than they needed, or at least as much as they needed. This is a direct consequence of the country's ambitious shift toward green power and away from nuclear. This came from Reuters.
Yeah, I got it here. In 2012, it had been 89%, so they're moving.
They're moving a lot. Yeah. Well, they had a lot of wind in Northern Europe. Mecklenburg-Vorpommern.
Well, I've got, and you can just see it. I'll see if I can pull it up a little bit.
Okay.
I've got a graph on exactly that.
Okay.
This is not wind, it's solar.
Oh.
But look, they get a lot more solar exposure in wintertime.
Interesting.
I thought it was. And it's happened 2 years in a row.
Wow. That's very strange.
They must have fog and clouds.
Maybe they've got LEDs that shine their light on the solar panels. I don't know. Powered by wind, of course. The next item is from Clean Technica. The number of Australian houses adding rooftop solar continues to surprise network operators.
I'm out of order here.
With another 2,794 systems of 5 kilowatts or less added during the month of August. The total capacity, this is rooftop capacity in Australia, is 11.5 megawatts.
I think I have that, but I'm out of order because the next thing I have here is about Glasgow.
Well,
which will be the next one, I guess.
I guess it will be. And this next one is kind of a puzzle. It comes from Business Recorder. An estimated 600,000 cubic kilometers, that's a lot, of water is trapped in mines beneath Glasgow, Scotland. A pilot project has been using the water to heat apartments for 10 years. The water is drawn, its heat is extracted, and it's returned to the mines where it absorbs heat from the earth.
So it's recyclable.
It's recycled.
This is
But
interesting.
It is interesting.
I never knew it was mines under Glasgow.
I didn't either. I'm not surprised, but I doubt very much that there's 600,000 cubic kilometers of mines under Glasgow.
I think you're right.
I would bet that what this really means is that there is 600,000 cubic kilometers of water available from the mines. And so they can use, that's the total heat resource for the energy they're using. In other words, there's groundwater around the mines.
600,000 cubic kilometers is a lot of earth.
That's a lot of earth. That's right. It is.
I didn't catch that one. It's just one of those numbers goes in one head.
If you think about that, that's 600 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers by 1 kilometer. And 1 kilometer is maybe that's okay for shallow mines. But 600 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers?
No,
that's like the area of New England or something. It's not under Glasgow.
You know, something you don't think about much, but water in mines is a way of life. I mean, the mines are below the surface of the earth everywhere.
Yes.
You know, underground mines are.
Yeah.
Then they fill up with water.
They
and
fill up
getting
with
that
water
out of there is a 24/7 job for the miners.
That's right.
While they're active.
That's right.
And of course, when they stopped operating the mine, they don't pump it out anymore.
Yeah.
So this stuff has been sitting there, getting warmed from the earth.
Right.
To me, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, whoever thought, this is a resource.
Yeah, it's a big resource, and as a matter of fact, it's a resource that would be available everywhere where you've got mines.
Where you get mines.
Because, as you said, they fill up. And, I used to live in a town in New Jersey where they had iron mines during the Revolutionary War. And, of course, the mines had long since stopped being used, but they were still there.
Still there, right.
And I knew people who, as children, now this was 30 years ago, so this is a long time ago, these kids were doing it, but they had vents to the mines that they knew about that had never been closed. Mm-hmm. And they would go down those vents into the mines where there were lakes in caverns. Mm-hmm. That is a bit scary, I think.
Well, over in the western part of the state, there's a number of, I guess they were limestone mines. They pretty well played out, but the mines are still there. And they're underground, but they're up on a mountain.
Okay.
And this one set of old mines fills up. It's got lakes, and the lakes freeze, and the local people go there to ice skate. They got it all lit up underneath because no snow falls on it,
Oh, wow.
And it's a big thing. We're talking over in Dorset.
Wow.
The road is up there. They maintain the road, and
amazing.
people go there to ice skate. They got, I guess somebody's selling hot chocolate.
Yeah, my job is selling hot chocolate in a mine that has been closed for 50 years.
In the summertime, people go up there just to explore, but in the wintertime, they actually take advantage of the fact that there's ice without snow on it.
I went to Polar Caverns, I think it's called, in New Hampshire.
Uh-huh.
Did a little tour of New Hampshire a number of years ago with my daughter, and I think my son was on that trip too. And but the Polar Caverns we went to in August, and it was extremely hot out, but the water in those little caves they had was frozen still.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's on the north side of a mountain. It never gets any sunshine.
So it stays cold.
It stays cold, yeah.
Yeah, there was a place up near Lake George I used to go to. They called the Ice Caves, and I'm sure it was a similar situation. There was ice there all summer long.
Wow. Anyway, going on, the Barry Montpelier Times Argus was the source of this next piece. The city of Burlington, Vermont now owns or has enough contracts with renewable energy facilities to provide 100% of the city's electric needs, as the city's municipal electric utility has completed the $16.3 million purchase of the 7.4 megawatt Winooski 1 hydroelectric facility.
That's part of their electricity.
Yeah.
Winooski Well, it's Burlington, not Winooski.
Yeah.
The dam is in Winooski.
Yeah.
Burlington generates about half its power with biomass.
Right.
And this Winooski Dam, been sitting there. They bought that and then
Yes.
just closed on it. That's about another 25% of their power.
Wow.
And they've got, you can see up there on the screen, they've got the
Wind.
Georgia Mountain Community Wind, which they don't own, but
it
they're buying the
provides
power
yes.
from it.
Yeah.
And they got a couple of other ones of these deals here, so they're now energy independent.
That's good for them. And of course, we've got that big thing.
It's all clean. It's all renewable.
We've got that big push to do Rutland too from Green Mountain.
Well, that's
Power.
Green Mountain Power.
Yeah.
We will get to that.
But of
We've
course,
got a couple things about that.
the Burlington is not Green Mountain Power. That's the Burlington Electric.
Burlington City Electric Company.
Yeah.
Yep.
On Saturday, September 6th, we got this from scinews.com. That is sci-news.com. In a research paper released by the journal Nature Communications, Dr. Patrick Jones of Imperial College London and the University of Turku. I don't know how Turku is pronounced. But
How else? It's got to be Turku.
This is Finnish.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's probably called Smith.
Right. In Finland. And his colleagues have reported for the first time a synthetic metabolic pathway for producing renewable propane. Now,
There's a picture of it up
this
there.
is good news and bad news, I think, because it's nice to have the propane, but synthetic metabolic pathway? Are you kidding me? That's GMOs. And the idea that something like this could get loose and just make propane all through the environment strikes me as a little bit scary.
Well, I'm reading the article here. I don't think it's GMOs in a traditional sense.
It's not the GMOs that we
They're
eat,
using E. coli, which we have in our
right? In our tum-tums.
in our bellies,
Yeah.
and they're irradiating it with, stimulating it with electrons, or they're irradiating it.
With
And-
electrons. Okay.
And here I'll read from it. It's possible to substantially enhance the catalytic capability of the enzyme and ultimately produce greater levels of propane.
So perhaps this is not a GMO. I might
It
have
may
read it
not
wrong.
be, not in the traditional sense,
Yeah.
where they're like putting pig
No.
genes into geraniums and stuff.
Oh.
I don't know. I think this is certainly something to look at.
It
because-
certainly is. I'm saying it's good news and bad news. Maybe
Yeah.
the bad news isn't so bad, and we could just make propane out of.
Well, the next step might be a little bit more GMO, because the main goal is to insert this engineered system into photosynthetic bacteria. Now you're talking GMO.
Now you're talking GMOs,
So as to one day directly convert solar energy into chemical fuel.
and that bacteria that is that does the photosynthesis is the stuff that used to be called, I guess it still is very commonly, blue-green algae.
I don't think this mentions that.
It doesn't mention it,
Yeah,
but that's
but
what
yeah,
it is.
yeah. I think I saw something
they
in a
have-
related
yeah.
article mentioning,
Yeah.
which is commonplace. It's
All over the place. It's a problem in some places,
Yeah,
like Lake Champlain,
yeah.
where blue-green algae. There's many different kinds of blue-green algae, some of which are toxic, and some of which are very good for you to eat. Spirulina being the example of that, and the stuff reproduces at a remarkable rate. You can get these small critters to reproduce at like divide, the cell divides in a lot of them, and they can do that every 15 minutes. So you get a doubling of the number of these things in ideal circumstances every 15 minutes.
That adds up quickly.
Yeah, it adds up very quickly. Yeah.
What's that story about the spoonful of water in a baseball stadium?
Yeah.
And it doubles every minute. It's
Yeah.
like, how long do you have before you got to get the hell out of that stadium?
Yeah.
It's not long.
It's not long. It's amazing. The yeast that's used for making beer reproduces
Yeah.
at about the same
Yeah,
time. You
yeah.
put a vial with about so much yeast into a fermenter, so much from a test tube, and 3 days later you've got an inch of yeast on the bottom of the fermentation vessel, and that is, and of course, when people make beer, that's very often just thrown away, because
Which shouldn't be.
it shouldn't be. No, I mean it could be used as food.
Animal food, definitely.
If not for human beings, it could be used as food for a variety of animals. It's
Yeah.
very nutritious. The only thing about human beings eating it is that it tastes like hops, and people are going to. A lot of people would be a little bit put off by sprinkling something that tastes like hops on the top of their popcorn. Nevertheless, it's there, and people are starting to make serious use out of materials like that, and also the other side products of fermentation of beer and things like that. Okay, going on. Clean Technica, Saturday, September 6th. A national study conducted through the month of August surveyed approximately 1,000 Australians and found that 82% of respondents believe that renewable energy target should definitely or probably be kept in place, with only 17% taking the opposite side of the argument.
And this is something we've been watching going on there. The government's way out of touch.
The government is way out of touch, and
well, it depends on who they're out of touch with.
well, yeah, right. They're not out of touch with the owners of the coal mines. But
yeah.
Tony Abbott's popularity has plummeted. It's down in the low 20% now.
Yeah.
And I think that we're starting to see the beginnings of his own party wondering whether this guy should be leading the country. And the renewable energy target, they were planning on, doing something about it, and they had a commission that was made up of people who were climate change deniers or whatever.
Another good one.
Deciding whether the target was going to be kept in place, and this was kind of a scandal. Now they've got people in the party saying, change the renewable energy target or get rid of it. Nobody's even talking about that. I don't know what to say about that except that, okay. On Sunday, September 7th, and this is, I think, the big news of the week, the Clean Technica reported that they reported on a new International Energy Agency report. And the International Energy Agency is pretty highly thought of. And they came up with this. The transition to a global renewable energy economy could save $71 trillion by the year 2050.
But save for whom?
Well, ultimately, I think this is for the average you and me type guy.
We don't count.
I think we're starting to.
We're starting
because
to.
we might put solar
It's
panels on our
interesting.
roofs.
I read this. This is global, and these are big numbers.
They're big numbers. Put another way, putting $44 trillion of investment by the year 2050 could translate into about $115 trillion in energy savings. Okay, now I started doing some real number crunching on this. And it turns out that's just the tip of the iceberg, the $71 trillion. Mm-hmm. Because by doing that, we would avoid the external costs of fossil fuels, which
You're
include...
talking illnesses and stuff.
Well, that's one of them.
Yeah.
Climate change is one. The damage from climate change is one. The illnesses and so forth. Basically, what it comes down to is, if we don't do this, we can expect to have about $2 trillion a year of external costs, which in that period of time would come to about $70 trillion.
They were talking about some of the changes of climate, the effects of climate change in Vermont locally right now.
Yeah.
And talking about what we all know is what some of the hurricanes have done to our roads.
Right.
But what's happening now is some of the thunderstorms, much more isolated, much more localized, are doing the same damn thing.
Oh, wow. Where did you get that, Tom?
It's on the radio this morning.
Oh, really? Now, you see, that was a piece of news I just missed completely.
Yeah, it was on Live and Local, or what they call it a new thing now, Vermont Morning, I think it is.
Okay. We should talk about that.
Yeah, because that's what they were talking about. Just last week, I think some town, it might have been Grafton, had a horrible thunderstorm that just wrecked about 5 miles.
Oh, man.
About 5 months. Just totally localized.
Well, you know, we had that thing in Alstead a few years ago, Alstead, New Hampshire, which is...
I'm not familiar with that one.
Well, Alstead, New Hampshire is, I forget the name of the river that goes through there, but Alstead is in a fairly narrow valley. And it's right close to the Connecticut River. It's a couple of miles in from the Connecticut River. But there's a big plain behind it. Mm-hmm. And we had a drenching rain that came down. It was similar to the rain that we had with Hurricane Irene, except that it was local.
We're talking about the same thing I just mentioned in Grafton. Or
and
whatever it was.
And that rain just, well, one thing that it did, there were farm fields in Alstead. I would drive by them and see crops there. The next time I drive by, it was just a field of stones. Not only had the crops been, it took all the soil away.
Wow.
And there was a house that was about 40 feet above the river in terms of height, and it was not all that far from the river. And the young man and woman who lived there refused to be evacuated because they were so high above the river that they thought there would be no danger.
They were immune. They weren't.
The river undercut the bank at their home, and it went crashing in, and of course their bodies were found a few days later.
Oh, wow.
These are problems this was something that was absolutely unheard of at the time. It also wiped out a number of dams. It didn't wipe out, it diverted the water around the dams on the Ashwillet River, and it wiped out roads in Hinsdale and places like that. The idea of having that kind of thing appear more commonly is not something I look forward to.
Well, the fellow that I was listening to on the radio was, sort of jokingly said the 100-year flood is coming every 4 years.
Well, it's expected to come every other year by mid-century.
Wow.
So this is just something that we have to deal with, and this is something also that we've been noticing more and more. There were 100-year floods or 500-year floods in Missouri and Iowa and places like that occurring every few years 10 years ago. My daughter took a train to, I don't know where she was going, but she crossed Iowa and I think Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, something like that. And she said, here was a train, which of course, because it was on a train bed, road bed, was several feet above the surrounding countryside. But she said this train was just running for a couple of hours with nothing but water on both sides.
Wow.
Where there should have been, and there was, under that water, farm fields.
This is flat prairie.
This is flat prairie. Yeah. It can be a very big problem. And of course, when you have a river like the Mississippi River that swells to be 100 miles across, that's a lot of water. So, the next item, from the Pensacola News Journal. Long stymied by high costs and local opposition, offshore wind is finally nearing takeoff in the United States as 14 projects enter, quote, advanced stages, end quote, of development, the Energy Department reports. These projects represent about 4.9 gigawatts of capacity.
Sounds like a lot, but when you think about wind, it's not.
Well, offshore wind, you're talking about capacity factors that are probably on the range of 45%.
Probably are, sure.
And that means that they're about half of a standard nuclear power plant. So this would be approximately 2.5 large nuclear power plants.
Okay.
That's
well, this is something that, I don't know, it's politics. They've been dragging their feet on this for
they had
decades.
Cape Wind had more than 20 lawsuits brought to stop.
Yeah.
And it's been in the courts, and finally, in the case of Cape Wind.
But we're talking from Florida to Maine.
Yeah.
We got a shallow coastline.
Right.
Going out 100 miles or so.
Right.
And who's it going to disturb? You get beyond 20 miles, you can't see them from the shore.
Well, one of the things that they talk about is birds. But I've read about the work that they've done on those birds. Tracking birds and so forth. You don't want to put wind turbines in places where migrating birds are going to be migrating.
But we know those places.
We know the places. The other thing is that many migrating species are birds who look at those wind turbines, which are sited half a mile or 3/4 of a mile apart, and they see columns of them, and they just fly up between the columns. They know exactly how to deal with that. This is something that's just in their, it's on their radar, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the birds that we have to worry about for wind turbines, as I understand it, are primarily raptors, eagles and hawks and
and there's
so
not
forth.
a lot of them out there.
Not that far out to sea, no. Okay, the next item, and this is on Monday, September 8th. This is a very interesting piece that was written by Amory Lovins. The title is Fusion Power, the Case of the Wrong Competitors. And what he says is startups hoping to bring fusion power to the market will fail for a simple economic reason. While their power plants may be competitive with traditional nuclear or fossil fuel plants, they will not be competitive with wind or solar.
And we're not looking at that.
We're not looking at that. The people, for years and years and years, I've been hearing people say, when we get fusion power, it's going to be revolutionize everything. And it looks like, according to Amory Lovins, and when I see the numbers, I think this may be true. It looks like fusion power is a technology that will never make it.
It may not.
Because it would have been good 30 years ago, but it's not competitive with renewables today.
I don't know if it's coming up here or not, but we certainly have talked about it. There's thorium reactors.
Yes.
And that's another technology that looks very promising.
Yes.
But again, we're not likely to see it because it won't be affordable.
Well, the reactors that Steve Rucroft has talked about on this show, I suspect will be affordable. The numbers that I have seen on it say that it would cost about $650 million to replace Vermont Yankee with an accelerator-driven system, and that would produce as much power. So if we replaced Vermont Yankee with that,
with $600 million.
Yeah, which is about.
It sounds like a lot, but it's not.
It's only about 20% of a traditional nuclear reactor. But the thing is, then you've got a reactor that could use the energy in the Vermont Yankee plant and in the spent fuel of the Vermont Yankee plant, and render it into relatively non-radioactive materials, which
that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, which would be there's no long-term or almost no long-term radioactive isotopes coming out in the waste of the accelerator-driven system, or as they're also called, energy amplifiers, but none of them has ever been built. And I think the reason they haven't been built is because the people who run the traditional coal, gas, and nuclear plants can't figure out how to make money from accelerator-driven systems without destroying the value of the plants they've got.
Probably true.
Yeah. Okay.
Probably true.
Business Spectator supplied us with this piece of information. I think this was also on Monday. It was. The Australian Energy Minister McFarlane and others within the coalition government are now publicly disowning the recommendations of the Warburton Review, which, by the way, said, they should get rid of or at least radically change the renewable energy target that they have. McFarlane told the Australian, which is a newspaper, no one's talking about scrapping the renewable energy target. No one.
No one.
Yeah. And that, I think, is a little bit disingenuous, because it looks to me like the Prime Minister was talking about scrapping the new renewable energy target, and they're starting to back off because the idea of scrapping it is such an unpopular idea.
Well, you can see it up on the screen, but I'll just read the sentence. Tony Abbott is about to be blindsided by a grassroots revolt over the renewable energy target.
I think that's happening. And
it seems that the Prime Minister has pushed too far, failing to appreciate that the renewable energy target is not simply the carbon tax, just a little bit smaller.
Well, Tony Abbott has been acting like he's got a what's the word? When a politician has the sufficient votes to do just about anything he wants.
I can't think of the word either. Huh?
He's acting like a man who's
mandate.
got a mandate.
Yeah, and
he doesn't even he's got a reverse mandate.
He doesn't even know it.
80% of the people in Australia are against him, and I think his party is about to pull the plug on him. That's kind of what I'm seeing. I'm seeing.
Well, if they don't, they're going to get the plug pulled on them.
Yeah, and I think that they may do it because they can see what will happen if they don't. It actually happened to the previous government.
Did it?
Yeah, where they pulled the plug on one of their prime ministers. Okay, the next is from the National. Renewable energy is the most competitive source of power, according to a new report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is not the same as the International Energy Agency. The report highlights the energy landscape and analyzes major dynamics underway. It is the product of 4 years of research. And we've talked about that a lot. It doesn't come as a surprise to me, and I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to you.
No, not at all. We've been talking about exactly this. I mean, I've said it in different words, but we're at a sea change.
Yeah.
The industry is going to realize that it doesn't make sense to pay for your fuel.
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't. Why would you pay for the fuel when you can have it from the sun for free?
We still need the energy. We're getting the energy. We'll continue
Yes.
to get the energy, but we're not going to need the fuel
As
anymore.
you have been saying a number of times, you think, and I think you're right, it is not going to be that many years before people are saying, pay for energy, electrical power? Why would we do that? The next item comes from Renew Economy on Tuesday, September 9th. The assessment of AGL Energy, Australia's largest privately owned power generating company, is that Australia has too many large, dirty, coal-fired power stations that have operated way beyond their working life, and their owners are refusing to shut them down.
Yeah, they don't want to lose money. It's greed.
It's greed. That's all it is.
It's greed.
And the idea that the government would be subsidizing these plants, they're taking the subsidies away from renewable power and giving them to coal. And
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on who's paying the piper.
Yeah. And how long is that going to continue?
Well, I would have thought it would have continued this long. So.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to that government, because somehow I have a feeling that Tony Abbott is not going to be the Prime Minister of Australia a year from now.
I read a couple of things here that I got highlighted.
Okay.
I didn't know this. Australia does not even have emission standards.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's why they had a coal tax, a carbon tax, because they didn't have emission standards.
Yeah, here they say the fossil fuel generators, the guys you just talked about, have their hand out for more money. They want payments for closure. We got to close down, but we want you to pay us to do it.
Yes, of course. And Tony Abbott doesn't want to pay them to close down because he doesn't want them to close down.
The fossil fuel generators have been so successful in playing one side of politics off against the other that carbon pricing, renewable energy, and energy efficiency policies are in a constant state of flux.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what's going on.
Well, guess what? They're in a constant state of flux in the United States as well.
Yeah,
and
they
the
are.
reason why they're in a constant state of flux is, I think, because we've got people in Washington, D.C. who are far more concerned about getting reelected, and the money that they get is coming from corporations that are far more concerned about making money than either one of them is concerned about maintaining the United States of America as a country.
Well,
Are you kidding
unfortunately,
me?
I think you're right, because that's certainly seems to be what's happening.
It is absolutely, I think, I'm going to say something that goes a little bit out on a limb here. I think it is absolutely unpatriotic, anti-patriotic, anti-American to back fossil fuels in light of the fact that, among other things, the Pentagon has said that this is a problem for renewable, for national security.
Mm-hmm.
And they identified it as one of the biggest problems going for national security is the fact that we are dependent on fossil fuels. And we've got 3.5 million people dying worldwide every year because of air pollution coming from fossil fuels. In fact, that'll be something that we'll touch on again soon. But I think we have to come to a point now where we have to look at these people in Washington, D.C. and say they are un-American. They are anti-American. They're not working for this country. They're working for people who don't care whether it exists, as long as they get their money.
Well, basically, yeah. Wall Street doesn't care.
Well, I think there are people on Wall Street who do care, but there are industries out there that are represented by people who really are far more interested. The purpose of keeping the United States alive for these people is to make sure that the financials are kept reasonably stable, so their money that they're making is worth something. And I think, they might as well be working for socialism. Are you kidding me? Is that a threat? The coal industry is a threat.
Don't frighten me with that S word.
Yeah, right. I don't know. Okay, getting on now that we've ranted for a little bit. From the Seaside Courier.
Oh, I read that every week.
Do you really?
Yeah.
San Diego Gas and Electric announced Monday that it's looking to buy 500 to 800 megawatts of electricity from local producers to replace what had flowed from the San Onofre power plant. Now, that would mean that they're actually looking for an amount which is only a quarter, perhaps, of what San Onofre was producing.
Probably about that, yep.
Yeah. And going on, it says at least 200 megawatts will be needed to come from renewable resources. Now, of course, I wonder how this ties in with that big wind farm that they're talking about putting in Wyoming, because that wind farm would be supplying power to San Diego. And that's I've forgotten, is that 1,000 megawatts?
It's pretty big.
3,000 megawatts.
The article mentions something a little bit different here.
Okay.
Similar but different. They're getting 23% of their energy from renewable sources now.
Yeah.
They expect it to bump up to 33% by the end of this year. And 6 years ahead of the state mandated target.
Right.
And they're crediting that to the Sunrise Power Link, which is a major transmission line that connects San Diego Gas and Electric service territory, which is what we're talking about,
Right.
to a solar and wind energy facilities in the desert east of San Diego.
Yes, which
And
I think
we've seen some of those desert.
that would include Ivanpah.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're getting a lot of sunshine power, and the sunshine power, of course, solar power comes along right at peak demand period. So if they get wind power in addition to that, they're going to be able to go well beyond that.
It kind of looks like it. I mean, they didn't plan on San Onofre closing, but
I
they
guess
gotta
they
deal with
didn't.
it looks like they're dealing with it pretty well.
I think so. It's interesting I don't think they've even begun to come to a point where they know who's going to pay the bill for that.
Oh, they got that figured out.
I don't think so. I think they're in the middle of a lawsuit with Mitsubishi.
Oh, okay.
To review this for anybody who needs to have the review, the San Onofre nuclear power plant has two big reactors. I think they're over a megawatt each. And they had a need for new steam generators. And this new steam generator.
The steam generator is outside of the containment vessel.
It's outside of the reactor, yeah.
It's an old-fashioned machine, basically.
It kind of is.
It's a turbine.
No, it's not the turbine. It's a heat exchanger that takes the heat from the reactor, use it to boil water, and the water powers the turbine. And the people at Mitsubishi said, you can get more power out of these things if you use more pipes and more tubes, and you pack them in a little bit closer together.
Okay.
So that's what they did. The problem is, nobody ever tested this new design. Okay, and San Onofre, the NRC is pretty strict about how things work. So San Onofre went to the people at the NRC and they said, well, we don't have to test this. It's basically a drop in replacement for what we had, which in some senses it was. It had the same hookup. It worked in the same amount of space. But the problem is because the pipes were, as the steam runs through these things, it makes the pipes vibrate. And because the pipes were closer together, they started to hit each other. And that produced wear. And so when a pipe starts to leak, you plug it up. Well, they looked at this and all of a sudden they noticed that there was a little bit of tritium in the system that shouldn't have been there. They opened up the steam generator and looked at it, excuse me, and found that the pipes were wearing out about 10 times as fast as they should.
So it was permitting the contaminated water to get into the so-called clean water.
Yeah, and so they looked at the other reactor, which had its steam generator replaced more recently, and it was having the same kind of wear problems. So they went to the NRC and said, this is our plan, and the NRC basically said, your plan isn't going to work. And I think the sense that I have is the people in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission were really upset that they had the owners of San Onofre pull the wool over their eyes by saying that this thing was a drop-in replacement when it wasn't. That's the sense that I have. I might be wrong, but that's my sense. It's
logical. Whether it's real or not, it's certainly logical.
Right. Well, what it came down to was that it was going to cost a couple $2 billion to replace these things. The plant wasn't worth the amount of investment that it would take. But of course, they'd only been in operation for about 1.5 years. So they had not been paid off. And so San Onofre has gone to the owners of San Onofre, which I think is the San Diego, I think San Diego Gas and Electric owns part of it.
I think that's
they
the
went
way
to
it is,
Mitsubishi and said, you should be guaranteeing this thing, and we want the price of this plant. And Mitsubishi said, no way. So I think they're in court. That's my sense, is that they have not figured out who's going to pay for it. But one of the things that they are kind of indicating is that maybe it's going to be the customers.
Well, that was my remark, was based on that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the ratepayers
If Mitsubishi isn't going to pay for it,
the ratepayers
will, because the owners aren't going to want to do that.
Yeah.
And the owners have got to make their money. Okay.
Ain't socialism great?
Yeah. Well, I don't know who owns San Diego Gas and Electric.
I think it's at least partly owned and not totally owned by San Diego Gas and Electric.
Well, San Diego Gas and Electric, is that a private company or is that
private?
It's private.
Yep,
okay.
that's investor owned.
Well, we've seen problems with investor owned, and we've seen problems with municipal or state owned when it comes to nuclear power. But the next item is from Energy Digital, and it says there were 2 records in the past week set in Denmark and Sweden. In wind energy and waste management, respectively. Denmark.
2 unrelated items.
Unrelated items, except that they're just across the water, short distance from each other. Denmark got 41.2% of its energy from wind so far this year.
That's incredible.
Well, you can't get more than 20% from wind because it'll destroy the grid. So obviously they're pulling the wool over our eyes with this thing. No, this is real. They've been reporting amounts that
they've had more than an average amount of wind this year.
They have, but of course also they've been putting up wind turbines like mad.
All over the place.
All over the place. They've got good wind resources and they want to take advantage of those. There have been times when the amount of power they got from their wind turbines exceeded the country's demand. The other one, this is something that I think is more impressive. It's just something that I hadn't thought about much. It doesn't surprise me, but it is an impressive figure. Sweden is sending only 1% of its waste to landfills. They're
way ahead of the curve there.
Yeah, they're actually importing waste from other countries because they regard it as a resource for making power. That's interesting. Now,
The last sentence of this article is telling, waste today is a commodity.
yes,
In a different way than it has been. It's not only waste, it's a business.
yeah, yeah. If you think about this, it makes sense. You know, we've had that kind of thing going in this country for a long time in terms of specifics. For example, if a car is in an accident, it doesn't get towed off to someplace to be melted down. It gets towed off to a yard where things that are useful get stripped from it.
Mm-hmm.
And basically they're doing something that's very similar with agricultural waste, you know, the manure from the pigs and the municipal waste. And
We're starting to look at this stuff as a resource, not something to get rid of.
that's right.
And they're
it's-
finding out there's money to be made by doing it.
That's right. There's a lot of money to be made by doing it, and it will prevent us from having to buy oil that gets pumped out of the ground and fouls our atmosphere. The next item comes from GulfNews.com.
That's not Louisiana, fellas.
No, it's not. 7 million people die due to air pollution across the world every year. But deployment of renewable energy can check this trend, according to senior officials in Abu Dhabi, which is not in Louisiana. It can also have very positive socioeconomic benefits. Now, we talked about this earlier when we talked about the fact that by investing $44 trillion in renewable power between now and 2050, we could save ourselves $71 trillion over and above the cost of the investment. Here we're seeing the human side of the story. People are dying, and they're dying 7 million people a year. How many people did the Second World War kill? 80 million or something like that.
I don't know. I really don't.
Second World War lasted from 1939. Well, it depends upon where you were. You might, if you were in China, you might say it lasted from 1937, but it lasted until 1945. So if you count it as 6 years, that's, you know, a multiple of this, but not a huge multiple of this. This is like a major war that just goes on and on and on and kills people indiscriminately, not just across other parts of the world where there are wars.
Well,
but
there's
in
always
the
just
United
been this
States.
mindset. I can exploit the world, and I can throw away my banana peels.
Yeah, that's right.
And it never was right. But now we're starting to look at it and say, no, you can't throw those banana peels away.
Right, right. You know, that's an interesting thing. You'd mentioned this before. I wonder what would happen if somebody could dump 8 million banana peels on the street of New York. What would they charge him with? I'll bet they'd get him for enough felonies to keep him in jail for the rest of his life.
It'd be more than littering.
Well, you know, what they do is they chalk up every accident that happened in the city over the next several years. You know,
Oh, yeah.
probably, and there's several days that you'd probably find that there would be fatal accidents, and the person would be charged with manslaughter. But nobody's being charged with the deaths of these 7 million people, because they need to have the smoking gun.
Well,
They
can
need-
you say impunity?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, these people are too important to even get charged, let alone.
Well, they aren't going to be too important forever.
No.
And, you know, it's an interesting thing here that I think maybe it would be a good idea for somebody to think about. Koch Industries is headed by the Koch brothers. And whether you think that they're good people or not, you know, if you look them up in Wikipedia, you'll find they're philanthropists because they give money to some opera company.
They do some good stuff. Some.
The various tribunals that have been run, for example, the Nuremberg trials, the defense of the people who were being charged, in many cases, they said, we were just following orders.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, they were saying what we did was in accordance with the law of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And the International Tribunal, which the United States subscribed to, said, I'm sorry, but there are certain things that you're just not allowed to do. And so you're being charged with murder. even though what you were doing was strictly in accord with the laws of the country that was being run by a bunch of murderers. All right? If you extend that type of justice to the Koch brothers, the day could come when somebody in the United Nations says these people are guilty of crimes against humanity.
Yeah, it
And
could
whether
happen.
they're guilty or not, you know, whether, you know, I'm not going to put my opinion out on the table for that. Whether they're guilty or not, the time could come when the United States would say, of those people, we're not going to defend them. We're not going to defend their actions. And their money could be stripped from them, and their liberty could be stripped from them. And that could happen, you know, at the drop of a hat, really, when you consider the pressures that are being brought by the United Nations, which is saying, stop supporting fossil fuels. They're saying that in so many words. Stop giving money to the fossil fuel industries, because we've got to stop this. You know, the United Nations is acting like there is a war going on with the fossil fuel industry. And there are a number of organizations that have said, we're not going to loan money to the fossil fuel people. We're not going to loan money for exploration. We're not going to loan money for new coal plants. And these are big organizations, international banks and things of that nature. And
But they're making their decisions based on pure economics.
I don't know that.
Yeah.
They may be, but I think that the pure economics really have got to a point where they are sufficiently in accord with moral considerations.
I think that's my take on it.
Yeah, that it has...
They're not doing this because they're good guys.
Well, they haven't done it until they have actually got to a point where they can look at this and say yes.
But they're doing it nevertheless.
They are doing it.
The motivation might be wrong, but the end product is good.
I think what I'm trying to say is the motivation may be partly wrong.
Okay.
But I don't think it's wholly wrong.
Okay, that's possible too.
I think there is such a thing as a good banker, just like I think there is such a thing as a good lawyer, and that's a little bit harder to wrap your head around, maybe. But
as you get further away from locality, it's harder and harder to find them.
Yeah, I suppose. I know there are good lawyers. I've known a few of them, but. It's a profession that has its detractors, let me put it, as does banking.
Well, you go south of the Mason-Dixon down, lawyer and liar are pronounced the same.
Oh, okay. Let's see now. That was, okay, the next item is from A New Economy. This is yesterday's, Wednesday, September 10th. The global shift to a world powered predominantly by decentralized renewable energy is happening, whether we're ready for it or not. And that is the main takeaway message from the latest report from the International Renewable Energy Agency. That from Renew Economy. And we're seeing more of this one coming in. You know, it's like, this is going to happen, guys.
It's happening, and for the very same reason we just discussed. It's
Yeah.
going to be economics that
That's
determine
right.
it.
And the thing that I find very sad about this is that, you know, when you consider people taking advantage of renewable power and having lots of money to spend on other things, that produces wealth. And where is that happening? Well, primarily it's happening in the rest of the world, not the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is about 14.5% renewable at this point, and the rest of the world is about 22%. Mm-hmm. So they're 50% ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
They don't have the big fossil fuel magnates running their government.
Yeah, that's right, I think. Anyway, the next item from Clean Technica. New figures from GMT Research and the Solar Energy Industries Association Q2 2014 U.S. Solar Market Insight Report. That's almost as hard as pronounced as Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. Show that the United States installed 1,133 megawatts of new solar PV capacity in the second quarter, pushing the cumulative operating capacity for solar power to 15.9 gigawatts.
I got a question and it hasn't been answered. Is
What's
that
that?
all solar PV, or are they talking industrial solar PV, rooftop solar PV?
Well, here's the problem. They're probably talking about solar PV that is grid tied and reported.
Yeah, exactly.
Which means they're probably not talking about rooftop solar.
Exactly.
Unless
or at least a lot
grid-tied.
of rooftop solar.
And the last figure I read, and I believe that this is now out of date, was that 44% of, the estimate was that 44% of solar capacity in the United States was not part of the grid-tied reported solar.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that number is going down because I think that I know, based on the reports, if the reports are correct, I know, the grid-tied capacity is increasing faster than rooftop capacity. The utilities are starting to take solar seriously.
Well, they are doing that, which is to their credit.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, it would be interesting, really, maybe I should do this, just look at the electric production capacity of Vermont and how that has changed over the years. Because we've been seeing more and more, particularly when, these solar farms that are being put up in Rutland and in other parts of the state. I mean, in Brattleboro, we're not leading the state, but we have solar capacity that we didn't have 10 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
And what was our production in capacity 10 years ago? Pretty close to nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're developing a solar capacity which, if it continues to develop at the speed that it has been developing, could put us into a position of energy independence within not all that many years, probably not within a decade, but not all that many years. And the point that I'm trying to make is that this report, which says 15.9 gigawatts, well, it might be more like 21. Mm-hmm. Instead of 15.
Well, in Vermont, what has traditionally been happening is the people who've been installing rooftop solar in the beginning did not have grid-tied solar.
Yeah.
And the cost of acquiring grid-tied solar, grid-tied solar, was so expensive. They said, no, screw it. I'll buy the solar array and not have to worry about it.
Absolutely.
That's changing now because people who have grid-tied electricity are finding out, if I spend a little bit of money, my electric bill is going to come
down.
way down, maybe even to zero. I might even make money on it.
That's right.
So that's a whole nother area that's opening up.
Yeah, and we've said this many times before. I think that it's important that we say it again because there are people out there who haven't got the word. The least expensive way to get electrical power in Vermont is to go solar. And it is Green Mountain Power. If you're in the Green Mountain Power service territory, which 75% of the people in Vermont are, and everybody in the BCTV broadcast area is, if you're in the Green Mountain Power service territory, it is possible to get help from Green Mountain Power and NeighborWorks of Western Vermont to go entirely solar. And if you've got reasonably good credit, you should be able to go to them and say, I want to do this.
And they're going to help you do it.
And they're not only are they going to help you do it, but they're going to help you do it for a very low cost, maybe no investment at all. In many parts of Vermont, it is possible to finance a solar 100%. And have the finance charges put on your electric bill. They're put on your electric bill.
Brilliant.
And then your electric bill goes down because you're getting solar power. So you save money right from the get-go.
I got a surprise for you here. You didn't give me this one.
Oh, okay.
But it's very appropriate. It's just about what we're talking about. Yeah. I picked this up. I don't even know where I picked it up, but it wasn't from an energy source.
Yeah.
And here is exactly what you're talking about. We talked about this last week. Green Mountain Power making an arrangement with a company in New Jersey called NRG.
Yes, right.
And there's the CEO of NRG.
NRG. And they're doing this microgrid in Rutland. Is that what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he's announcing the partnership.
Okay.
You know, he's talking about,
And they're talking about extending this through the entire. Actually, they're talking about extending it through the entire state.
basically, yes, absolutely, yeah.
You know what we're doing here, Tom, is we're running out of time. So I think we're going to. I have got one item left,
yeah,
but
I
I'm
think
going to
I got
save
one
it
more.
until next week.
Are we that close to running out of time? 3
got-
minutes?
I think we've got, according to that, we've got 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Well, I guess we'll keep this one for next week.
We
then.
can do that. I'm going to keep this one item, which is not all that important, for next
I'm
week.
on the
And
wrong
what we'll
screen
do is
here.
we'll say goodbye to everybody who's watching us on broadcast. So I'm George Harvey,
And I'm Tom FInnell.
and we will say, watch us next time, and until then, have a really good time. Okay.
This particular article is interesting. I wanted to talk to you
You want
about
to keep
it.
going on this?
Well, we can talk
Yeah,
about
okay.
it. We're
All right. I think we should get back in our maybe we should just say hello to everybody if we're going.
well,
on
we
a
can do
channel.
that.
Hello,
If
everybody.
anybody's still watching, here we are. We're still here.
Okay, we're back, and we're talking about a couple of items that didn't make it onto our regular show because we ran out of time. But we're also going to go back, I think, and talk about the idea that we can save money by going to renewable.
Mm-hmm.
So you had something you were talking
Well,
about there, Tom.
this is just interesting because I've heard you talk about a Stirling engine.
Yes?
And the thing he talks about, or this article talks about, is
No,
the Beacon 10 Stirling.
This is NRG?
Yeah.
Okay. We were talking about NRG, energy.
The New Jersey
making it-
corporation that just made an agreement, a partnership agreement with Green Mountain Power.
Right, and-
not to provide power, but to provide energy-saving devices and technology.
All right. And one of them is a Stirling engine?
Well, the one they started out with, this is a demo that's happening while they're announcing this thing. Apparently it's on stage.
Wow.
It's a Beacon 10 Stirling. It's black with a glowing blue light about the size of a large chest freezer. It emits a constant low hum. In this one, it's in the basement of the Essex Resort and Spa. Converts natural gas into electricity, enough electricity to power an average-sized home.
Natural gas. I wonder how much gas they're using. Does it say?
Well, it doesn't say. You know, it's just one of the. And again, I'm reading it. It's just one of the technical innovations on offer at NRG Energy,
Right.
a national company that is about to use Vermont as a testing ground for its products and services.
Wow.
And they're doing it in conjunction with Green Mountain.
Right.
Now, they have the technology. They don't have the exposure. Now they're going to get the exposure. Because even if you read about the technology in, Popular Mechanics or something, where do I get it? I go down to my local hardware store, and he doesn't know where to get it.
Yes, of course.
But here we got Green Mountain Power saying, this guy's got
Here's
it.
where you've got it. Now, we should talk about Stirling engines for a minute.
That's what I wanted to mention.
Oh,
'cause they're
goody.
interesting. You talked about them, and as I understand it, they're an external combustion engine.
They can be an external combustion engine, but they don't necessarily require combustion.
All they require is heat.
All they require is that you've got one place that's warmer than another place.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that these things can be made so sensitive to that difference of temperature that if you have a little small demonstration machine, and you can buy these things.
Oh, yeah, they're available.
You've
They're
got
like toys.
There are machines that are kind of like
Educational toys.
Educational. You can put one on the palm of your hand,
Uh-huh.
and the difference in the temperature between your hand and the air is enough to drive that machine.
Okay.
All right, and in fact, the record that I remember, and I unfortunately don't remember what the metric is. The record that I remember was that there was a Stirling engine that was demonstrated that ran on a difference of 1 degree in temperature, and I don't remember whether it was Fahrenheit or Celsius, but my guess is it was Celsius. Mm-hmm. So that's the equivalent of a little less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So 70 degrees here and 68 degrees here is enough to drive
To
this
run
engine.
that energy.
And if you think about it, what this means is that if you had a Stirling engine that you could put at your home, just digging a pit, if you dug a pit that was a few feet in diameter and went down 8 or 10 feet, and you could make sure that that pit would stay pretty much empty of water and things like that, you could just have that be the bottom part of the bottom area that acquires heat from the ground.
It's going to be about 50 degrees year round.
It's going to be about 50 degrees year round, and that Stirling engine during the summer, you're going to be pumping heat out of the ground and putting it into the air. You're going to be pumping heat out of the air and putting it into the ground, where it dissipates. And then during the winter, you're going to take it out of the ground, put it in the air. And the only time when the thing won't run is when the temperature is about 50 degrees out.
Yeah.
And the thing would just keep going. Now, the problem with a Stirling engine is that they're relatively expensive to build relative to the amount of energy they produce. But they are renewable if you want them to be. You don't need to have a fire under one.
Okay.
And if you wanted to, you could put a solar collector that collected heat, like the ones that people use for hot water, and you could put in that pit in the ground a bunch of water, and then that would if it were warm out and cold, if it were warm in that water and cold outside, you could get a fair amount of electricity from that exchange. And similarly, if you could change this thing so that it would paint it black so that the upper part would be hot in the sun, and you could run it much more efficiently during the summer to put that heat into the ground. And it's one of those things that it has moving parts, but the moving parts are very simple. The engine is very simple, and it will just run. As long as you've got a heat differential.
As long as you've got a thermal difference.
As long as you've got a thermal difference. And I could explain how they work if you want to know. I'm not sure that it matters. But
depends on how long it takes you to do it.
Well, basically what happens is hot air is heat. When you heat air, it expands.
Yeah.
When you cool it.
Yeah.
All right. So you have a piston. And the piston is not like the piston in a car. It's a big piston that is very, very light. You might make the piston out of styrofoam.
Okay.
All right. So you've got this piston, and it goes up, and then it's the area above it, is cooling off. The area below it is warming up. So it goes up, and when it gets up there, what happens is that another component of this thing is moving the air around, so you have more air to cool off and to warm up rather, and you have I'm getting it wrong. But it's basically just the air heats up, it expands. The air cools off, it contracts. And you have this air constantly moving back and forth.
And you got a piston moving, and you harness that movement.
So as the piston moves, it pushes the air into the other chamber.
Okay.
You see, and so the thing is just constantly going. And it's a brilliant design, and there have been cars that have run on it, which of course ran because they were heating the air with gasoline or oil or kerosene or whatever they were using to heat it, and those cars never really made it in the real world, which is why
they probably cost too much to build. And
the problem is that you need a really big piston. And that's not cheap because of the size. But it is the kind of thing. It gets in your way too.
Huh? It gets in your way too.
It's the kind of thing you can get if you go to Wikipedia and look up Stirling engine, you can get a lot of information. It's sufficient that a person who really felt like building one of these things could build it.
Could do it, yeah.
You see, and so I don't think there is any zoning permit that you need to put a Stirling engine in your yard. So,
they'll figure out one.
Yeah, well, if enough people did it. But this is the kind of thing that could be used under some circumstances. I wouldn't suggest anyone build one.
Well, it's got to make sense for generating electricity.
It's got to make sense financially.
There's got to be some reason why you've got natural gas cheap enough to generate power.
Right.
Cheaper than power.
Well, as I said, you could do this with solar thermal.
Yeah, right.
And you could just
Right.
do it. And if you had
So
that
the fuel
solar
cost
thermal,
is nothing.
right? What you would have to do is, if you had solar thermal and you had a system where the solar thermal was going into water, and the water was being used to heat the air in the system, so that would give you a capacity that would keep running overnight. You could run this thing overnight in the winter, because you'd have water in your well that heated
warm.
the air, and it would just go 24/7 during the winter. But the problem, and during the summer, you could run it in reverse, where you're taking heat out of the sun. You could actually change your solar thermal collectors so that they're putting heat into the top part of this thing instead of the bottom, and you'd run it backwards and you'd get power. The problem is, what do you do when you don't have a sufficient difference? And that's a little bit of engineering that would have to happen.
Either that or you go to Florida for a week.
Yeah, I think I would not go to Florida because I don't think I'd like it much. But I might go to Nova Scotia.
Okay, that's allowed.
Yeah. Okay.
The ending of this article
Okay.
touches on something that we've talked about. It's the vulnerability of the grid.
Yes.
And she's not talking. She meaning
Mary Powell.
Powell.
Yeah.
Not talking about the vulnerability to terrorism that we discussed.
Right.
But rather the vulnerability to weather.
Weather. Absolutely. This is a serious problem.
I'll get basically from the article. While the existing grid, with its endless string of poles and wires, may have served the country well during the 20th century, it's becoming incredibly costly to maintain in the 21st.
Right.
And part of that, we've already talked about, the weather.
Yes.
The weather's changing. When Mother Nature rolls in, it's twigs and twine. The power, instead of poles and wires to the weather, it's twigs and twine.
Yes. You know what this...
And spending millions of dollars every year to fortify the twigs and twine.
Yeah. It
Doesn't
reminds
make
me.
sense.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the perfect storm. The perfect storm was a real thing. It actually happened.
Yeah.
It came a few weeks after Hurricane Bob, which hit Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts, the area around Cape Cod, and the perfect storm happened in the same place. And at that time, I was living in the Plymouth, Massachusetts area, and so I was there for both. And the Hurricane Bob went over my house.
Did nothing.
I went over my house, and I went out and saw clear sky when the eye was going over. Not for very long, but I was in exactly the wrong place for that, and it wasn't all that bad. I did hear explosions, and it turned out that was because it was just a loud noise of very large pine trees snapping. But afterwards, I went out, and people saying, "Go back to your house. Go back to your house." There's live wires all over the place, and of course, we were without power for about a week or 10 days. The perfect storm came, and there was very little warning. I went to work early in the morning, 8 o'clock, something like that. And by about 11 o'clock in the morning, they were saying, "Go home," because there's a storm. And I went down to the place where I worked was right on Plymouth Bay. So I was 100 yards from the shore. And I went down to a little road that went along the shore. It was just inside a water barrier, one of those walls, seawall. And what was happening was the waves were hitting the seawall very, very hard because of this storm. And those waves were hitting the seawall so hard that they were going up 4 stories. And
wow.
they were getting caught by the wind up there and blown across the top of the building and coming down on the cars in a parking lot. So these cars were getting covered with salt water.
Yeah.
But the thing that was interesting was that they had poked holes in the mortar between the stones and the seawall, and the road was right against the seawall, and so every time a wave hit, pieces of asphalt would go flying up in the air 6 or 8 feet.
Wow.
And when I went back the next day and looked at that seawall, the blocks of stone that were in that seawall, which were about 5 feet long and about 2.5 feet wide and 2 feet tall, several of them had just washed out to sea. if you can imagine a stone of that size washing out to sea. These things weighed tons, and the water was just kicking them around as though they were toys.
Yeah.
Well, storms, twigs and twine.
Yeah.
Yeah, twigs and twine.
Twigs and
I
twine.
would think not twine, maybe thread. But when these storms come, you know, and when the storms that we're starting to get hit by are not just bringing down the electric lines, they're bringing down the roads.
Yeah, yeah.
The people who are going to fix those lines have to drive on to fix them. Mm-hmm. And so what's going to happen? Well, of course, I don't expect to be around at the end of this century. If I am, I'll be 150 some odd years old. But I would be unsurprised if Brattleboro, during the course of the 21st century, didn't come to a point where it was without power for 2 weeks or longer.
It certainly could happen.
What do you do about 2 weeks or longer without power? It's bad for business.
For sure.
So wouldn't it make sense to do something about that? And that's what Mary Powell is talking about.
Well, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and she's way ahead of the electrical industry.
Oh, way ahead.
She's looking at this and saying, you know, we'd like to stay in business, but doing what we've been doing isn't going to work anymore.
Yeah.
How can we do something that we can do well that's going to keep us in business?
Well, you know, we're talking about a time in which the electric power companies, a number of them, not all of them, and you know, there's an interesting statistic that goes along with this too, and I forget exactly what the numbers were, but I remember the ratio. There were something, as I recall, there were 600 utilities in the United States. Mm-hmm. It might be that there were 1,200. I don't remember. But the number of utilities that generated their own power was only about 1/6 of the number that actually existed.
That's probably true.
Most utilities don't make power; they just transmit it.
Right, right.
And so, what's happening here is Green Mountain Power, by putting in solar farms and you know, they own some wind turbines. Mm-hmm. They're moving from a company that is transmitting power into being a company that is manufacturing power. They're making power now because they own.
Yeah, they are.
Not big time,
No,
but they're
in
helping.
a distributed way. Again, the model's changing.
The model is changing.
Instead of a huge coal-burning plant over here, they got 50 or 100 small generators.
Right, and what they're doing is and I've seen other organizations referred to in this using these terms. They're moving from a centralized generating paradigm into and a transmitting paradigm. That combination. To a different paradigm, which is called energy management.
Exactly.
And so Mary Powell, I think, is right on the cutting edge with this. You know, this is a woman who is kind of intelligent, I suspect.
I haven't met her, but I'm impressed with what I've heard.
I'm impressed with what I've come across. And you know, we're seeing a new trend, a new set of trends. And energy management, yes. What does that mean? Well, if you have distributed power and you have these microgrids that they're talking about, it means that the microgrid can exist, providing for local customers, even when the grid goes down.
That's what she's basically saying right here. Electricity doesn't have to travel nearly as far to get to customers.
Yes.
By converting the old grid into a series of, quote, mini-grids,
Yes.
Vermont will minimize energy costs while reducing carbon emissions.
Absolutely.
And by the way, reducing the cost of maintaining.
And by the way, keeping the money, which is being spent on the cost of the power, in the state,
in the state,
instead of delivering it to the hands of somebody in Louisiana.
And she justifies the partnership that she just come out with. And that makes sense, too. We're one of the smallest electric companies in the country. We can't afford to hire the scientists and inventors and pay for them to kind of figure out these next big things. Enter NRG Energy. $1 million energy company is as bullish on distributed energy as Powell and Shumlin. Shumlin apparently put the two of them together.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that's not a surprise. But
and the CEO, which we had a picture of up there, said he's eager to use Vermont as a testing ground for products such as electric vehicle charging stations, electricity storage units, and small-scale solar arrays.
Right.
These are things they make.
Right.
Okay? For us, it's the perfect size, place, and location to integrate on a scale that's meaningful, but, not starting with New York City, for example.
Right. Right.
GMP has signed a contract, but Powell says the document will not tie the utilities' hands or prevent them from working with other energy firms.
Yeah.
So it looks like a good deal all around.
It looks like a good deal.
So Energy will sell products and services to Green Mountain Power, which will in turn sell them to Vermont ratepayers. As I was saying before, if you read about this in Popular Mechanics, you go down to your local hardware store. He says, I don't know where to get it.
Yes, that's
Green Mountain
right.
Power's going to say, hey, I'll send a guy up there next Tuesday. He'll tell you all about it.
Right. Right.
It sounds like a good idea.
It does. It does. It sounds like something that could work very well.
Well, while we're on that subject, and we're not anymore, you said you had one more thing that you wanted to talk about
Well,
today,
we could talk
and
about
I think
that.
I got it here.
Which is that?
Printable solar cells.
Yes, that's something that it's interesting, and we're gonna have to have that on the regular show next week because I think it's important.
It is important.
Yeah.
I'll bring up a picture of it.
Okay, this came from Science Alert, a group of Australian solar power experts known as the Victorian Organic Solar Cell Consortium. Victorian referring to Victoria,
Victoria, Australia.
Yeah, which is an
not
state,
the old Queen.
not the old Queen. Has been working on printable solar cells for the past 7 years, and now they're about ready to hit the market.
They print the solar cells directly onto plastic,
On plastic.
which they described here. We print them onto plastic more or less the same way we print our plastic banknotes. They got plastic
They
money.
have plastic money. Yes. Yeah. I don't know how much it costs to print these things, but they're not the only group doing this.
Well, they say it's very cheap.
Yeah. IBM is working on this too.
Yeah, they are.
And when they get to this, who knows what they're going to get to, because if you can print it on plastic, you can print it on a coating that on a piece of metal, for example. And if you can print it as a coating on a piece of metal, which could then be coated with something else to make it very durable, you could put it on a piece of metal that might be, for example, a standing seam roof piece, which means that you could have a roof,
That's a solar
which
generator.
a solar generator, and it's just printed on.
Looks like a roof.
And it looks like a roof. And it means that you could put these things on the faces of siding for buildings.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that brings us to a point where we could have a really kind of new paradigm. If you think about a roof, for example, that has the roof peak running north and south, that means that half the roof is facing east and half of it is facing west. Okay, is that good for putting up solar panels? Well, it means that the solar panels are only going to get sunshine part of the day. And if the panels are part of the roof, as opposed to standing at a good angle to the sun, then they're not going to operate efficiently. But, on the other hand, if they're not operating efficiently, it doesn't matter if they're sufficiently inexpensive.
They're still roof.
They're still, they're the roof. And if the roof is generating power, if half of it is generating power at, say, 10% half the day, and the other half is generating power at 10% the other half of the day, then you've got a very big area to generate power.
And it's free energy.
And it's free energy. And if that costs you very little, because the only additional cost, in addition to replacing the roof that you had to replace anyway, hopefully, is the printing these things on and having somebody hook them up.
And the article said hooking them up is easy.
It's easy. So you're at a point where if you've got a roof that you have to replace, maybe this would be the way to do it, even if there isn't good siting for that roof. And you know, you get to a point where people talk about efficiency. You have to take efficiency with a grain of salt. You have to know what it means in order to know what it means. And so, you know, you ask, for example, what is the efficiency of a wood stove? And the US DOE can say this particular brand, this particular model is 73% efficient. I looked into that and I discovered something, and that is the wood stoves that they listed, every single one of them had the same one of 3 levels of efficiency. They were all, I forget the exact numbers, but it was like 67% or 73% or 80%, something like that.
All the same number.
They were all of them had those numbers. And when you look into it more closely, you see that the old-fashioned box stove or pot-bellied stove was going to be 60%. Mm-hmm. The newer stove that was you know, the Ashleys that had restricted the air intake,
They had a heat exchanger inside, and
these things were 70. If they had a catalytic converter to convert the exhaust, then they were higher.
Yeah.
But what did it mean in terms of the amount of wood you had to burn in order to heat your house?
Very little.
It means very little. Yeah. That's right, because they had no idea how this thing was installed, how much heat was going to be going up the chimney, and so ultimately, the numbers that they were using are only meaningful if you understand the meaning.
Okay.
And you know, the thing that I did was somebody was talking about rocket mass heaters, which have a very rapid combustion, which they pipe the exhaust through a series of bends and turns in the flue that eventually go out horizontally through a wall. And the heat of the combustion chamber is like 1,000 degrees Celsius, but the air coming out is like 40 degrees Celsius. You get so much. You
suck all that heat right out of it.
You suck all that heat out of there by having a big heat exchanger going into a thermal mass. And if you look at that, you realize they're sucking things out of that aren't even, most people don't even think about, like the waters, the phase changes in the water from steam to water. And that's appreciable.
It is, yeah.
There's a lot of heat there. And so where the DOE could say that stove is 80% efficient, you could put one of these things in and discover that it reduces the need that you have for cordwood by 75%. And so you say, well, wait a minute, how can you?
The numbers aren't coming out.
The numbers don't come out. And the reason is because you don't know what efficiency means.
Yeah, yeah.
So people were talking about these things being 250% efficient, just like they talk about heat pumps being 250% efficient. That's not what it means, really. It's a number that doesn't make sense, but it does mean that you compared to something else. Well, okay. So when we're talking about efficiency, we have to take that with a grain of salt. I got set off on this tirade by something you said. What was it? Do you remember?
Not anymore.
Okay. Now
we were talking about the printable photovoltaics.
Printable photovoltaics, of course. Thank you, Tom. What does reduced efficiency mean?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, here's the question. Not the efficiency in terms of, it's not, the efficiency in terms of the available energy in the sunlight versus what you get in the electricity is irrelevant. The thing that's relevant is the amount of electricity you get.
That you can use.
That you can use, but in terms of the investment you've made.
Okay.
So the cost per kilowatt hour, or the cost per, capacity that is actually going to be delivered. And that's what you have to ask. And when these things are printable,
they can be really cheap.
They can be really cheap. And I used to be in the printing industry, and I know what expensive printing is. We had a job once where the raised print business cards.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, those are usually pretty cheap. If they're just one color, they can be very inexpensive. We had one job which involved a card that was about, it was a card about this big. And that one job, the guy wanted one piece, just
One card.
one card. But it had to be printed. It could not just be done by an artist.
By an artist, yeah.
You know, and the reason was because he wanted the raised printing. And the raised printing involved tacky wet ink, getting a resin put on it that carried a pigment, and the resin was melted in place by heat that came from a exposure to a radiant heater. And we charged, I think it was $75 for the one copy. It was a special setup. I needed to do a whole bunch of special things in order to do this. And of course, there was a thermographic printing plate that was involved, and there was artwork that had to be done, which I had to copy photographically in order onto the thermographic plate, and so forth. So it was $75 for one piece. And okay, I'm aware of what expensive printing is. When you can print something that is, you know, a replacement for a solar panel, and you can just print it, and you can print another one, and another one after that.
And a million of them.
You could, yeah, depending upon the. I mean, if they're printing these by a really fine silk screen, it would be an expensive thing to set up. It would be relatively expensive to run, and the screens don't last forever. They run out after a couple thousand impressions. That would be expensive, but it's cheap compared to other ways of making solar panels. Very,
Exactly.
very, very cheap. If you're talking about something that could be done by some sort of engraving, where you've got a gravure press or something like that, and then possibly transferred from there using a transfer process, such as the way that people make decals, you could make them by the millions. You could make them by the millions, and they could be stored as long as you want them, and then put on. So you could say, yeah, well, we need 10,000 of these tomorrow, but let's make 1 million of them, and then we'll have a supply that'll last for a little while. And you could cut the cost of those things down to practically nothing. And you know what? I kind of expect that these things will be printed on standing seam metal roofing.
Well, it makes sense.
And when they are, I have a feeling that we're going to be in a position where the price of solar panels will go to almost zero, and the price of standing seam metal roofing without the solar panels will go up, because people won't want that as their preferred product.
Well, they'll probably stop making standing steel roofs without the solar panels on.
That's exactly the point. It would become the standard.
It's going to be
thing.
cheaper just to make the one kind, and if you don't want them, so what?
Yes, that's right. That is right. If it's north facing and it's not generating power, so what?
It's still keeping the rain off your head.
Yeah, it's keeping the rain off your head, which is the big price of these things.
Yeah.
So, you know, it may mean that the cost of solar PVs will go to practically zero. And the marginal cost of producing power from those PVs will be practically zero. And the financing costs will be practically zero. And why would anybody pay for electricity when it's free?
Yeah. It's coming.
So this brings us back to Green Mountain Power. And this brings us back to, you know, NRG and their Stirling engines. The Stirling engine, yeah, you run a Stirling engine, it's practically free. If you're doing it without using natural gas.
Yeah.
If you're doing it with natural gas, it's going to be inexpensive. But if you're running solar power and it's practically free, why do you put in wind turbines when solar power is practically free? Well, you put in wind turbines. Why would you have, same reason that you would have Green Mountain Power managing your power system? It's because the local grid, the mini grid, the microgrid, is going to be more resilient if it's tied to the rest of the world. And the test of its resilience will be, when that is brought about by a bad storm, is not the default, not the standard position. That's the position that becomes expensive, because you have to somehow manage distribution when you don't have enough, and you've got to tell everybody that they've got to reduce their power load, which could be done on a smart grid automatically.
Yeah, with permissions in advance, it would be no problem.
Exactly. So that you say, the homeowner has got a very minor responsibility, which is to make sure that the vital systems that they've got are on circuits that are marked vital. And the non-vital systems are on circuits marked non-vital, so that you can shut things off. And basically what happens is Green Mountain Power would be managing power, and there's money to be made managing power.
Exactly.
It means they have to be paid for things that they're not paid for now. Nobody pays them specifically for maintaining the power lines or managing intertie systems or things like that.
Not directly.
Not directly. But, the system is going to have to change. And it means that some of the things that they aren't being paid for directly, that are not being specified on the bill, they will start charging for it. And it may be that the connect fee goes up. But on the other hand, the connect fee goes up, but the cost per kilowatt hour goes to nothing. Who's going to mind?
Yeah.
So have we got more, Tom?
I don't have any more here.
Well, we're at a good point here to tell the people at BCTV, thank you very much. We've got a half-hour show here.
I'll buy that.
Okay, so we will say goodbye to everybody again. Not for this show, but, twice for a second show. Tom is saying goodbye. I will say goodbye. And hope to see you all, or hope you will all see us, because we won't see you, at least not on television. Not looking the other way. The stuff in the monitors in front of us is just seeing ourselves. Maybe that's what it's all about, seeing ourselves. Have a good week. We spin and we toil, we work all day, sowing and reaping, we store goods away, so we can be dressed well on the day that we die. We dig and drill and waste what we find, break up the earth, leaving little behind, but we will grow lilies in the by and by. I want to point out that the sun shines down its power to all the world and makes the wind blow